Bronze monuments to slavery declare allegiance to a dying myth of white supremacy. In 2017, Louisiana state authorities bowed to long-standing activist demands to take him down. And yet the structural legacy of settler colonialism and slavery remains intact. It pervades the air we breathe. This footage shot by Rise St. James, a community activist organization based in St. James, Louisiana, captures a flare burning off excess pollutants at CF Industries, the world's largest ammonia production facility. According to Rise, flaring events are common and recurring, each lasting many hours at a time. The 75-foot-tall flame towers on its monumental stack, above the majority Black communities of Donaldsonville and Lemonville. It is permitted to emit ammonia, nitrogen oxides, and PM 2.5, pollutants classified as acute toxics and environmental hazards. As the toxic legacy of slavery pervades the air, so does it invade the ground. CF occupies land once dominated by 3 sugarcane plantations, where enslaved people were worked to death and buried on these grounds. All along the Mississippi River, the luxurious manners of slave masters are preserved by historians, romanticized by tourists, and celebrated as wedding venues for a white elite. Meanwhile, the cemeteries of the historically enslaved are lost to a hostile landscape, only stumbled upon when industry breaks ground.
No more racism. No more racism. No more racism. Oh,
My name is Sharon Levine. I'm the director and founder of Rise St. James, right here in St. James Parish, and we are here to commemorate the graves of our enslaved ancestors. We're going to stand together.
That's right.
And we're going to fight for Mosa.
That's right.
We will not allow them to take our ancestors out of this ground and put them somewhere else.
Right.
We are Rise St. James, and we're going to stand up for St. James Parish. This is our home. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Formosa have a fight on their hands.
Rise St. James commissioned forensic architecture to gather evidence in support of their claims for accountability and reparations. By bringing visibility to lethal airborne pollutants and searching for traces of erased Black cemeteries that cling to the earth. If toxic air is a monument to slavery, how do we take it down? Rise founder Sharon Levine lives in the historically Black community of Welcome, at the heart of an 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, known as the Petrochemical Corridor. Here, 200 industrial facilities produce some of the nation's most toxic air and highest risks of cancer. And air quality is only getting worse. Like the climate of racism, toxic air pollution is largely invisible to the eye, which enables politicians to deny its existence and deride residents' decades-long demands for justice. In the 1980s, environmental justice activists nicknamed the region Cancer Alley. Today, residents refer to their homeland as Death Alley. Each and every plant occupies the footprints of fallow sugarcane plantations. Death Alley is a continuum of environmental racism spanning 300 years. After emancipation, small towns grew from rows of plantation slave quarters. These free towns have become today's fence-line communities, sharing property lines with massive industrial facilities. This racialized spatial pattern is contiguous with Death Alley. The community of Lyons was a quiet rural free town until the intrusion of Marathon Petroleum Company and Cargill Inc. Today, these corporations own all of Lyons, save for 5 homes. 2 historic Black cemeteries are surrounded by industry. Marathon even owns a portion of one of them. While a picture of dispossession comes into focus, surviving residents must also contend with unseen occupying forces. We asked Earthworks, an environmental action group, to employ a technique called optical gas imaging to bring invisible hydrocarbons into the visible register. We cross-referenced a photograph captured by our field technician with Marathon's permit documents and determined the contents of the tank, along with this mix of toxic pollutants it is emitting. What begins at the scale of a single tank seeps across broad geographies and dozens of communities. Additional techniques can expand the scale of analysis, revealing the extent of this chemical assault. The Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality maintains a database of all permitted sources of toxic and criteria air pollutants. We focused on 6: chloroprene, ethylene oxide, benzene, ammonia, nitrogen oxides, and PM 2.5. We developed a 3D fluid dynamics simulation of these pollutants, using meteorological data from a local weather station over a period of 12 hours. The pollutants linger in the air, following the speed and direction of the wind. In July and August, the prevailing wind blows from the southwest. From September to November, the prevailing wind blows from the northeast. For approximately 6 months of the year, the prevailing wind blows from the southeast. From this simulation, we were able to determine the average concentration of each pollutant for each wind direction. Revealing the suffocation of communities caught between the plants. When the wind blows from the southeast, the majority Black town of Reserve is smothered with high concentrations of PM 2.5. And chloroprene. But when it blows from the southwest, the suburbs of Laplace are hit with the same toxic clouds. The southwest wind also carries thick plumes of pollutants downriver over the majority white towns of Gramercy and Vacherie, which have blocked corporations from constructing in their backyards. Our simulation illustrates the truism that toxic air doesn't obey political borders, and it captures a vision of the future. If local residents can't stop the construction of 2 new facilities on either side of Welcome. Formosa Plastics would saturate Welcome with high concentrations of ethylene oxide, well above the standards set by the EPA's acceptable threshold for cancer risk. Louisiana's air quality standards are among the lowest in the nation. If South Louisiana methanol is approved, Welcome will be hit with high concentrations of particulate matter. The community of Lemonville is sandwiched between several facilities and breathes in high concentrations of PM 2.5, nitrogen oxides, and ammonia. Scientists have yet to understand how persistent exposure to the combination of these 6 pollutants impacts public health. But residents on the ground have sounded alarms for generations. We can use our simulation to visualize toxic emissions at the scale of a neighborhood, as from this community garden in Lemonville, where residents recall decades of acrid smells and burning eyes.
Growing up as a little girl, we used to smell those many different odors. So we wasn't, didn't know no better then. And sometimes we would go inside and we would complain about having a headache or a stomachache from the smells.
You can still smell it now until today.
Right.
You a little girl, so that means they're still doing it.
You're right.
They never stopped. They're probably doing even more. Because anytime she wasn't even outside playing. She passed in her car, and it all through her car, and she could smell it.
Yeah.
I feel like we're dying one at a time. And just like I said,
numbers.
When we breathe, we feel like we're being wiped out.
My trees are turning black. I had to cut them down. We can't even make garden here because everything is bad. The water is even bad. I never drank water the whole while I lived in St. James. But right now, the problem is all of these tanks, all of the fumes that we're smelling, okay? I can't deal with that anymore because I know how sick I've been. I've been sick for too long. So I know I'm going if I got to just go. If they don't buy me out, I just got to get out.
When we breathe, we feel like we are being wiped out. In 2014, the St. James Parish Council passed a comprehensive plan to sustain the values of its citizens. It begins by reminiscing about a bygone era of luxurious living and delightful ease, when acres of land were counted by thousands and slaves by hundreds. It goes on to designate the majority Black community of Birdland as an industrial zone, even though people still live and die there. And it redesignates the majority Black community of Welcome as existing residential future industrial, planning my ancestral home out of existence.
Federal law requires petrochemical companies to identify historic sites, including cemeteries, that would be threatened by their development. They hire for-profit archaeological firms to survey the field. We have studied over 50 field reports and have found a systemic lack of regard for antebellum Black cemeteries. Formosa's archaeology firm found nothing to impede construction, and Formosa's permits were approved. But members of Rye's new ancestral burial grounds were at risk. They hired a sympathetic archaeological firm to investigate and confirm the presence of 3 cemeteries on site.
Formosa Plastic has repeatedly searched in the wrong place for the burial sites on the Acadia property. Even when told to go back and look again, the firm that Formosa Plastics engaged looked in the wrong site.
A thin ribbon was ostensibly laid by Formosa to protect the burial ground. Yet it bounds the wrong location. Even before Formosa broke ground, 2 of the cemeteries on the property had already been desecrated by prior development. Large gaps in federal law leave cemeteries unprotected in the face of state or private development. If allowed to go forward, Formosa's plant would occupy 3 plantations. Each plantation has at least 1 cemetery for its enslaved population. There are over 500 plantations across Death Alley, of which over 200 are on the market for industrial development. Under Louisiana state law, cemeteries have perpetual protected status, but first they must be located. We're in a race against time to develop a strategy for recovering hundreds of missing cemeteries before industry breaks ground. To determine the probable locations of cemeteries, we need to travel back in time. We sourced and georeferenced aerial imagery from 6 decades. Using a technique called cartographic regression, we created a mosaic of each set. A picture of the past, prior to the era of petrochemical development, comes into view, enabling us to study the transformation of the land. To travel further back, we located, georeferenced, and analyzed 140 years of historic charts, maps, and surveys. We enter through a 1719 chart of indigenous territory, which colonists used to prefigure their genocidal dispossession. The land of the Homa people became the Homa's plantation. The manuscript edition of the U.S. Coast Survey charts the Mississippi River from Point Homas to New Orleans between 1874 and 1877. It is the earliest cartographic record we have located that depicts plantation components: the river, the forest, crops, structures, roads, plantation property lines, and plantation owners. And on occasion it depicts cemeteries, albeit with an inconsistent symbolic logic. As with the aerial mosaic, we built the historic regional view, sheet by sheet. The 1878 edition of the U.S. Coast Survey covers approximately the same area. The absence of crops allows for easier analysis. The cemetery symbology in this series differs from the 1877 edition, while some previously mapped cemeteries disappear altogether. The final map series critical to our research was charted in 1894 by the Mississippi River Commission. It offers an additional insight. Contour lines delineate the gradient topography, which slopes from the river's natural levee to the back swamps, from the high-lying domain of the slave master to the low-lying world of the enslaved. Despite their detail, the 1894 maps do not appear to consistently mark cemeteries. While a few are illustrated, it is unclear why most are omitted. Finally, we sourced property surveys, archival photographs, architectural drawings, and archaeological reports, which enabled us to study the evolution of specific plantations over the decades. The maps reveal that plantations operated according to consistent organizational logics. To illustrate this point, our study is a composite of several plantations. The maps became the ground from which we grew structures as simple volumes. A plantation is equal parts industrial facility, farm, prison, death camp, and luxury estate. It was designed to enforce racial segregation, incarceration, surveillance, and forced labor. Capitalist tools wielded to maximize productivity and profit. We chose to fly past the slave master's big house and bring focus to the underrepresented back of the plantation, where Black people were forced to live, labor, and die. Rows of cabins for the enslaved population were constructed along the main plantation road, at a remove from the big house, surrounded by fields of cane. For the enslaved, each day began with the ringing of a bell to herald roll call at the industrial sugar facility. The facility consisted of a boiling house, a steam-powered sugar mill, and chimneys and vents, which spewed smoke and steam into the humid air. Over time, plantations were mechanized and outfitted with the latest technologies. The bodies of enslaved people were treated as mechanical tools, tortured and discarded if they fell out of line. During the autumn harvest season, adults and children alike worked grueling 18 to 20-hour work shifts in a race to beat the arrival of the winter frost. The frenzied pace was a product of the imposition of a tropical monocrop on a subtropical climate. Profitable cultivation of sugarcane demanded vast tracts of land, the clear-cutting of forests for timber to fuel steam-powered sugar mills, and a large enslaved population supplied by the domestic slave trade and breeding programs. Interviews with formerly enslaved people testified to pregnant women laboring in the fields throughout their term. If an overseer wanted to whip her, they would dig a hole in the ground to protect the unborn asset. Some enslaved children were born in the very fields where they would work their lives away. At night, enslaved people reclaimed the paths of their daily toil, repurposing the furrows between rows of cane to move clandestinely across the plantation, to perform ritual in the forest. As sugarcane became Louisiana's dominant crop in the mid-1820s, cultivated fields expanded exponentially, and the primordial forest retreated, giving way to a rigid Cartesian grid. As the necroeconomy of the sugar plantation reorganized life, so did it manage death. Sugarcane was notorious for being the most dangerous crop to cultivate. and Louisiana's sugar districts bore a negative demographic growth rate among the enslaved population. Slave masters would not sacrifice valuable land for black cemeteries. So enslaved people were interred in uncultivated lands at the back of the plantation, at the edge of the cypress forest. As cultivated fields expanded, cemeteries became isolated islands adrift in seas of cane. Denied stone, the enslaved relied on simple wooden grave markers, which decomposed over time. But sometimes they planted magnolia and willow trees to mark the graves of their loved ones. Isolated clusters of trees, or uncultivated patches of land that interrupt the fabric of agricultural fields, are referred to as topological anomalies. The memory of the land can be recovered through our mapping portal. Some anomalies are found to be ruins of plantation facilities, while some are revealed as sacred groves. These sacred groves are often the only surviving traces of antebellum black burial grounds. As development expands, anomalies are transformed and erased. Plantation logics are inscribed into the surface of the earth. Sometimes plants trace the contours of slavery's ruins, from industrial complex to sacred grove. We identified nearly 1,200 anomalies in the mosaic of 1940 aerial images, but fewer than 350 remained in 2021. Their erasure is the result of a persistent racist imaginary, which regards Black cultural sites as unworthy of preservation, or worse, as a threat to development. The surface traces of many cemeteries were likely raised prior to the 1940s. How might we recover their memory? In the absence of an archival trace, we can determine the areas most likely to contain cemeteries by considering multiple factors that bear on their siting. Traditional archaeology focuses on the big house and other relics of white supremacy. It considers the topographically elevated front of the plantation as a high probability zone for cultural resources, and the low-lying back as low probability. We have inverted these logics. We determined land at lower elevations to be zones of high probability for finding Black cemeteries. The 1878 maps reveal the extent to which the natural forests were cleared as sugarcane expanded across the landscape. Black cemeteries were established in a liminal zone between river and forest. And while we have no data on cemeteries beyond the forest edge, it remains probable that cemeteries exist within. Colonial land grants divided territory into private parcels. Property lines were drawn perpendicular to the river and extended 40 to 80 French arpents, or 1.5 to 3 miles toward the back swamps. Each parcel was oriented along a central axis, the main plantation road, and further subdivided into a grid of roads, field paths, and fields. Cemeteries near the river were located within 350 meters of the property line. Cemeteries toward the center of the plantation are located an average of 230 meters from the main plantation road. The industrial mill and enslaved people's quarters were bound to this grid, aligning with the main plantation road. Many black cemeteries are located within 800 meters of the mill. On large plantations with fields that extended beyond the 40 arpent line, we sometimes find a second set of back quarters. These quarters also have their own cemeteries, located within 400 meters of the end of the row. From the interlocking components of the typical sugarcane plantation, we can weave a field of probability. Redder areas are more likely to hold a cemetery. Anomalies that fall within this field, and under the shadowy threat of future industrial development, must urgently be protected and investigated through careful and respectful ground truthing. The entire landscape is revealed as holding historical and cultural value that we can still defend and recover.
We have a new vision of historic preservation
that redresses centuries of dehumanization,
devaluation, neglect, and erasure.
By recognizing our communities, our ancestral sites, and our wider ecology
as indivisible and worthy of protection.
Formosa's not coming here because God wants us to live, and He wants us to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and have productive soil. He don't want His people to die because of the greed for money.
We want reparations
for past and ongoing atrocities
against people and the earth.
Ecological reparations would span from the air
to the ground,
from the graves to the trees,
from the land to our descendant communities who rely on the land to live.
We want a moratorium on industrial development.
We want jobs that sustain the communities and our health.
We want petrochemical companies to clean our environment.
We want agency over how these lands are stewarded.
We want to live.
If toxic air is a monument to slavery, only ecological reparations can take it down.